Tonight, the long police roll of dishonour.
It's an absolute disgrace. It's a failure of leadership. There are obvious integrity issues. It's a huge disappointment.
It's the police corruption and cover-up scandal that sparked a national crisis in confidence.
I got angrier and angrier as I read some of these contents are disgraceful.
Their conduct in this matter is utterly inexcusable.
We've been through and are in the Me Too era, and it should be within the judgment of anyone in senior office that allegations of this nature should always be taken seriously.
The findings were so damning that many people will be looking at that and saying what went wrong.
Here's what went wrong.
A young woman made repeated complaints about the conduct of former Deputy Police Commissioner McSkimming, and instead of being investigated, they were labelled as false and used to prosecute her. When McSkimming was finally investigated, former Police Commissioner Andrew Coster is accused of inappropriately trying to influence it and of also misleading the Public Service Commission.
The current Police Commissioner, Richard Chambers, believes their actions could amount to a cover-up.
I want to apologise to the woman at the centre of this for the repeated early failures in following the proper processes investigating this matter by those at such a senior level of police.
I don't think this IPCA report can be the end of the matter with these police officers. I think they have to be investigated. What I would like to see is an investigation to determine whether charges need to be laid, because I want to know if these guys broke the law, and if they did, I want to know that they will be charged.
The scandal emerged publicly a mere week after this bombshell.
McSkimming admitted to having child sexual exploitation and bestiality material on work devices.
The ongoing fallout has been immense and intense, externally and internally.
A police source told the Herald McSkimming's disgusting actions reflect poorly on all officers, and it's a shameful time to wear the uniform.
I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, the police scandal that goes all the way to the top, with allegations of corruption and high-level cover-ups, and this involves former Police Commissioner Andrew Coster. We look at what exactly happened, what needs to be done to ensure it doesn't happen again, and whether public trust in the police force can be restored.
This is something that goes to the heart of police integrity in New Zealand.
That's New Zealand Herald's senior reporter Jared Savage, who helped reveal the scandal. I also chat to Newsroom National Affairs editor Sam Sachdeva.
Can we trust our police, the people who are meant to enforce the law? If they can't be trusted to follow the law themselves, how can we trust them?
We'll have more from Sam in a moment, but first, Jared. He got onto the story about a year ago when he heard whispers that McSkimming was under investigation for an incident involving a young female non-sworn staff member, now being referred to as Ms. Z. At the time, McSkimming had just missed out on the police commissioner role.
We heard the IPCA was involved, and we asked questions of the minister. Nobody would say anything, no comments all round. But there was a curious sort of response from the police in which they said, look, there's another case connected to this, which everything is entirely suppressed. And reading between the lines, that sort of like, publish anything about this at your own risk. So we had no idea what that was about.
So Jared kept digging and discovered the young woman involved in the incident was being charged under the Harmful Digital Communications Act for allegedly sending dozens of emails to McSkimming, media outlets and politicians.
She had made these allegations against McSkimming of a sort of sexual, physical, psychological kind, and they had been in some sort of a sexual relationship. She was in her early 20s, he was in his early 40s, huge power dynamic imbalance there. And instead of investigating her emails, they had charged her with essentially a campaign of harassment against him to destroy his career. These emails were coming in sort of the 6 months before the Commissioner of Police appointment process. So, you know, there was a lot at stake for a lot of people. And unfortunately, everything was completely suppressed because essentially at that point, McSkimming was deemed by the courts to be a complainant in a case. And so therefore, sort of publishing all this stuff would be, in the court's eyes at that point, extending the harm caused by these emails. So it was all bubbling away under the surface. But what, of course, then happened was that the police actually did their job eventually and started investigating these complaints made by the young woman. They interviewed her, undertook other investigations. And as part of that, they got the then Deputy Commissioner McSkimming's search history on his work devices, which showed literally thousands of searches for pornographic material. And amongst that material were a more serious subset of what could be classed as objectionable material. There was child sex exploitation and also bestiality searches that had come up on his work devices. So somehow he's circumvented the security protocols in place for police, and then he had to resign.
The charges against the young woman were also withdrawn, but Jared still couldn't report any of it because of suppression orders. So he fought the orders, and last week they were finally lifted, which allowed the Independent Police Conduct Authority report into the handling of complaints against McSkimming to be released. It was immediately headline news.
It's a sad and dark day for New Zealand Police. That's Police Commissioner Richard Chambers on the scathing report into senior officers' handling of the Jevon McSkimming investigation. The IPCA report sees a multitude of deficiencies, as some of the country's most senior officers had been aware for years of a woman's complaints against the man who rose to become Deputy Commissioner.
When an official investigation was eventually launched last year, the then Commissioner tried to run interference.
The matter, when referred to the IPCA, saw the then Police Commissioner attempt to influence the nature and extent of the IPCA's investigation and its timeframe.
Asked today if there had been a cover-up, Chambers said, "The way I read it, that's exactly what happened." On Costa's behaviour, he said it's an absolute disgrace. It's lacking in leadership, it's lacking integrity.
The Police Minister and Police Commissioner quickly fronted a joint press conference full of remorse.
At the centre of the investigation is a woman who has been let down by the previous police executive and the system. I cannot express how frustrated and disappointed I've been since becoming aware of the situation. I can assure her and all New Zealanders that the government is taking these findings extremely seriously.
The big sort of bombshell that we dropped later in the week was the fact that Ms Z was still facing charges.
This is the front page lead in the Herald this morning. Revelations that the woman complainant at the centre of the McSkimming scandal is still facing charges from police. This despite a 24-hour apology tour by Commissioner Richard Chambers.
Court documents reveal in August this year, she allegedly sent abusive emails to the detective who investigated her and to their wife. She was charged again under the digital harassment law, which carries maximum penalties of 2 years in prison or a $50,000 fine.
This big apology was put out to her publicly. Everyone, the Commissioner, the Minister of Police, all extending genuine sort of apologies, I think, or heartfelt sort of sympathies around the situation that she's been put through. And then on sort of, I think it was Thursday or Friday, I wrote a story saying, she's still facing charges because allegedly she sent some emails to the detective who had arrested her originally for the charges that we now know were the result of misconduct, So getting answers around that has been difficult as well because it's all tied up in the legal process. So, you go back to the Commissioner and say, should she still be charged over this? What's the public interest? And they kind of say, well, look, our hands are tied. It's with the Crown now.
Jared, how would you describe the treatment of the victim throughout this whole process?
It's had a devastating impact on her. And the IPCA is quite good at explaining this, saying, well, look, here's someone who sent a whole bunch of emails through, making complaint against a very senior, powerful person who, in her words, abused her and told her things like, well, if you raise complaints, like, nobody will believe you. And there was an allegation by the woman that McSkimming said, well, look, if you do raise complaints, I'll distribute photos of you in compromising positions and things like that. So you can imagine someone who's very scared to make a formal complaint, sends through these emails, which on the face of it look quite abusive and perhaps a little bit hard to believe. Because at this point, McSkimming is a shining beacon. He's the number 2 police officer in the country, clean-cut guy, serious allegations, and yet the police didn't do their job.
Tanya Kura, for example, former Deputy Commissioner, she kept worrying about the impact the allegations would have on McSkimming's career. She kept McSkimming up to date on investigations into the emails. Former Assistant Commissioner Paul Basham, who the IPCA report says was unreasonably preoccupied with making sure that McSkimming was not unfairly disadvantaged in trying to get the Commissioner's job.
They bought McSkimming's version of events, which was that, look, we've had this consensual affair. It's gone wrong. It's turned sour. It's gone toxic. She's trying to destroy my career now because, she wants to get back together or whatever. Well, there's nothing in any of the emails that talks about her wanting to get back together with him. She's simply raising concerns and complaints about him. And yet the police have bought that narrative, and instead of looking into it, they've literally charged her, put her before the court, and brought the full weight of the state down on her. And it's all completely suppressed. And so I think the treatment is appalling, to be honest. And again, the police will need to be accountable for that at some point as well. I imagine there will be a bid for compensation coming through once all the court proceedings are finished. To carry on with the second prosecution against her, this adds insult to injury, I think, to be honest. So this is going to carry on for some time yet, and I'll be interested to see whether sort of the public pressure around this changes the perception of Wellington as to, the way forward for the police.
There are calls for these police officers that were involved and that covered up and didn't do their job, that they should also be investigated and charged.
Because I want to know if these guys broke the law, and if they did, I want to know that they will be charged. Because right now, unless, of course, something changes, not all of them, but some of them are just going to get away without any consequences for what is being called a cover-up.
Realistically, Jared, can you see this happening?
The police have a huge job here rebuilding trust and confidence in the police. And one step of many is to probably have a good look at this, to look at the facts that have been brought out into the light by the IPCA, look at the law, look at how that can be applied to these facts and make a decision around it, and then communicate that decision to all of us. It wouldn't be enough to say, oh, we're not charging them. There would need to be an explanation for it. At the very least, there needs to be some sort of criminal investigation led by someone very senior, reviewed by a senior King's Counsel, to do that, because otherwise how can the public have confidence that, again, the police just aren't looking after their own?
Because does this case reveal sort of deeper cultural or systemic issues from within the police force?
Yeah, and the sad thing is that we've actually gone through this before, the Louise Nicholas sort of scandal, where, again, a young woman had made complaints about senior police officers of rape. They hadn't been investigated. A number of very senior police officers were charged. Some were convicted, some were not. But more importantly, there was a Royal Commission of Inquiry, which was essentially called the Baisley Report, which came out and basically poured sunlight into the police culture of the time and found it was essentially a very disturbing boys' club. And basically, any complainant of sexual assault was not treated that well, not believed. And to the police's credit, they have done a lot to implement the 70-odd recommendations of the Baisley Report, and they have made progress in that. This is not like the dark ages like it was back in the 70s and 80s. However, what this latest stuff with McSkimming has shown is that there's still work to be done. And I think this is such a big scandal that there needs to be a similar commission of inquiry or ministerial inquiry to look into the wider issues that we've got going on here. I don't think it's enough to say we've seen the IPCA report, we're going to bring in an Inspector General of Police, we've got a new commissioner, now we all need to move on. I think 20 odd years after the last report, I think it's time to have another good look under the covers, really, because clearly not as much progress has been made as the police would like us to believe. And again, it comes back to public trust and confidence. We need some transparency around this. It's not enough for the new commissioner just to say, trust me on this. Even if you believe him wholeheartedly, and by all accounts, he's a pretty straight shooter, straight up sort of guy. The public needs more confidence, and we need more transparency and things wider than the IPCA, it's wider than the issues covered in the IPCA, in my opinion, need to be looked at much more closely.
So what about the future of former Police Commissioner Andrew Coster, who is still employed by the government?
This is his personal opinion, I think he will struggle to keep his job. Andy Coster hasn't spoken to us yet. We don't know what he's thinking. But from looking at the IPCA report, he had justified a lot of the decision-making that went into this along the way to the IPCA. And you can kind of see the thinking behind it. But the reality is that his judgment had been clouded by this belief in McSkimming, his deputy, was a good guy and that someone else was out to destroy his career. I don't think for a second that Andy Coster knew or thought that McSkimming was a bad guy and was deliberately trying to cover it up. I think he thought that McSkimming was a good guy and therefore it was unfair how these untested allegations were going to harm his career. Now, the problem with that thinking is that you don't know whether or not these allegations are true or not. And this is what's led us to this point.
The next point for McSkimming is sentencing next month for possession of objectionable material.
That does carry the maximum sentence of imprisonment. However, and I've covered a few of these different kinds of cases where home detention has been an outcome as well. And I think it's probably a fine line. It'll be somewhere between short term of imprisonment and home detention for a year. Obviously, his reputation is in tatters over all this, and certainly won't be working in the police or any other kind of government agency anytime in the future.
Newsroom Sam Such-Davis says while some of McSkimming's offending occurred under the coalition government, he was actually appointed by the Labour government, adding an interesting twist to the political blame game.
I think there has been a lot of concern expressed by the government. They're in an interesting position where, some of the behaviour that is detailed in this IPCA report happened during their watch, but that was just after they came into power, and this is, for the most part, involved people who were appointed by the previous Labour government. Andrew Coster was a Labour appointment, Javon McSkimming was appointed as Deputy Commissioner under the Labour government, so that's maybe given the coalition a little bit more freedom to be, outspoken and really come down hard on this. So you've had Judith Collins say, if I was named in this report, I would be ashamed. Mark Mitchell talk about how unacceptable it is, and a litany of ministers really lining up to condemn the behaviour and the conduct that's been outlined in this inquiry from the police watchdog. So, yeah, I don't think that there's been many punches pulled, maybe a couple of exceptions, but, overall, I think quite condemnatory, and the fact that, all of the IPCA recommendations have been accepted, and in fact they've gone beyond that by saying, look, we actually need a new watchdog, we need a new Inspector General of Police to ensure that there is proper accountability and oversight of what our police force is doing. The status quo isn't good enough. I think that's them trying to show that they are aware of the gravity of this situation and the fact that the status quo is simply not fit for purpose.
What sort of pressure does this put on the Police Minister and the Prime Minister? And also I note, Sam, that the Police Minister came out so strong saying that this was corrupt.
The system that works in my office had worked up until the time we had a corrupt police executive.
And then on Q&A, then sent in a note saying, I talked out of line.
Regarding my comments on corruption, I acknowledge that the IPCA report did not use the words corrupt or corruption, and on reflection, I misspoke.
Are they under that immense pressure at the moment?
I think so. There's a desire to condemn this, but on the other hand, I think with some of these individuals, at least certainly Andrew Coster, who is still at the Social Investment Agency, he's on leave while an investigation's being carried out, there's a bit of wariness, I think, about saying anything that could prejudice those sort of employment matters. The last thing the government would want is to have some sort of additional payout that has to be made. So I think there's a lot of pressure to be going through the right process, but pressure also to be seen to be dealing with this, because this goes to the fundamental heart of trust, really, as a country. Can we trust our police, the people who are meant to enforce the law and hold lawbreakers to account? If they can't be trusted to follow the law themselves or due process, then, how can we trust them? So the stakes couldn't be higher, really.
So how does the government restore public trust and prevent a repeat performance? Does this start with an independent inquiry?
Look, I think it's certainly an option. Mark Mitchell, the police minister, has said we're open to that. You've got a few different avenues. At the top end, obviously, is the Royal Commission of Inquiry. That's sort of the most significant inquiry that a government can launch. But you've got other steps as well, things like I think government inquiry or ministerial inquiry, whatever the technical term is. I think they've sort of said, look, we want to go away and properly digest this report and look at what it's recommended and start making changes. But I think there's a case there because, the IPCA has said they found no evidence of collusion. There's this issue of whether or not what has been detailed amounts to corruption. You're right that Mark Mitchell walked back his comments. On the other hand, Judith Collins said, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, well, So that clearly implies that, she sees some evidence of, at least arguably corrupt behaviour. And if that's the case, I think there's a strong argument to say, well, maybe this IPCA report isn't enough. Maybe you do need a royal commission or some other form of inquiry with greater powers to compel the release of information and force people to provide evidence and look at whether there is a more systemic issue here, whether it goes beyond a few bad apples, as some in the government and the police commissioner have been keen to label it.
Do you think the government perhaps underestimated the public reaction to this scandal? And I'm talking about trust issues, the police culture, transparency, and how we view them now?
Look, I think there is an argument that they perhaps could have taken a stronger response. And I'm not talking so much about what the ministers said, but, there's the question of Prime Minister Christopher Luxon and to what extent he should have been involved and led some of this. I think, Luke Malpass, the Post's political editor, talking about that and the fact that he, Chris Luxon was largely absent, was absent entirely when the initial response to the report came. And to an extent, that's not surprising. He does tend to delegate a lot to his ministers and leave it in their hands, compared with what, say, Jacinda Ardern or John Key might have done. But
so do you think, though, that he should have front-footed it on that first night?
I think so. I think, that, as you say, this goes to the heart of trust in our public institutions. And as the Prime Minister of New Zealand, he is the one who is the face of public trust and of the government. So I think there's an argument that, yes, Mark Mitchell should have been there. Yes, Judith Collins should have been there. But, you probably should have had the Prime Minister fronting up and spelling out exactly how concerning this was to him and exactly how significant the government response was intended to be.
So how does this case feed into the broader narrative about trust? And I'm not talking just about police, but public institutions, political leadership, perhaps more broadly.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one, and I suppose we are in a environment of ever-decreasing trust in public institutions and the extent to which conspiracy theories and disinformation, misinformation can proliferate online. And here we have a case where this is not disinformation or misinformation. This all happened, and it is all laid out in damning detail in that report. So that is only going to fuel some of those conspiracy theorists and other areas, right? So this is deeply unhelpful in that regard, and I think it will proliferate more widely. There are still questions to be asked about, how Andrew Costa was appointed to the Social Investment Agency, whether there was enough due diligence done there. And this is not just about Andrew Costa either. I've seen some people talking about this. This is not just one individual. There are a number of individuals who were found in that report to have made wrong decisions, to have been too trusting of those above them. So there is a question around the institutional culture here, and that is something I think that is, quite damaging, not just for the police, but more broadly.
How much pressure is Richard Chambers under to perform, and is he the right person, do you think?
Look, I think he's under an immense amount of pressure. He is now leading a police force that, in the eyes of some, is seen to be corrupt. I'll make clear that's not what the IPCA report says, but that will be something that a lot of people will be thinking. In terms of is he the right person, it is probably helpful, it's very helpful that he himself is not identified as being at fault in the IPCA report. He was out of the country when a lot of this was playing out. He was on a secondment or certainly working for Interpol in Europe. So his hands are relatively clean compared to, any number of the police executive who have been named in this report. So that gives them a little bit of a distance and I think a mandate to come in with a broom and sweep out any remaining vestiges of this sort of executive or this culture within the police. But look, I think immense pressure to show that he does have clean hands and that everyone else in police does, and that this argument that, look, the actions of a few senior leaders should not tarnish the wider police force, he's going to have to prove that. And I think there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on every action of every member of police in the coming years.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Jared Savage and Sam Suchdeva. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by William Saunders. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.